Hello and welcome back to the In Focus podcast. I'm Philippa Lamb, and today's episode is something of a milestone because instead of digging into a single topic, as we usually do, this time we're looking ahead to what 2024 may bring for businesses and their accountants. There are few certainties for the coming 12 months, but we are expecting a spring budget and, of course, elections on both sides of the Atlantic. Beyond those relative certainties, well, it is hard to give a positive spin to what looks likely to be another challenging year of stagnant growth and weak business and consumer confidence. But to bring a little cheer, to fill in those brushstrokes and share their predictions for 2024, we brought together the winning team who sat round this very table a year ago and gave us what proved to be some very solid predictions for 2023. Iain Wright, ICAEW Managing Director of Reputation and Influence. Hi, Iain.
Hello.
Francis Haque, Chief Economist at Santander UK. Hello, Francis. Welcome back.
Thank you. Hello.
And David Williamson, Political Editor of the Sunday Express. Welcome
Hello.
back.
Great to be here.
How's your year been, everyone?
Oh, it's actually been quite a good year, I think. My son has moved from an obsession with steam trains into an obsession with dinosaurs, so I feel like I've spent a year living with a paleontologist. Yeah.
Interesting times, though, Francis.
Whenever aren't there interesting times over the last few years, I have to say challenging, but never a dull moment.
Iain, what would your word of 2023 be?
I think in general, it's either polycrisis, just all these crises coming together. Although I saw yesterday the word of the year, and it shows how much of an old man I am now, is Riz, and I have no idea what that means.
OK, I'm going to ask the journalists at the table.
Oh, you have so much of it. It's what the kids these days say to describe charisma. And so it's blazing Riz.
Now, I should say we're recording this just ahead of Christmas, but this time last year, you all shared your thoughts on 2023. Not an easy year to read. David, you said the government's main aim would be maintaining stability and stopping the UK turning into Brittany, a British version of Italy. I think we can say they tried, can't we? Francis, you were worried about ongoing weak consumer confidence. You predicted the cost of living would force more people back into the labour market. Well, that obviously happened. And Iain, you flagged wage inflation, labour unrest, both as ongoing problems. You told us you expected inflation to fall but linger on, and so it came to pass. So 10 out of 10 for everyone. Today, we are mostly looking ahead, but should we just quickly look at the past year? How do we think the economy fared, Francis?
Well, I have to say, better than expected. As I recall at the end of last year, pretty much all economists were predicting a recession to follow. That didn't happen. Now, whilst that's wonderful news, that is tempered by the fact that it's really just stagnant growth that we're seeing. So, but we'll take anything that's positive. And I think inflation, it's difficult to predict that one because we'd obviously pretty much hit the peak back when we were doing the podcast last year, and we were expecting it to fall. And, you know, by and large, it has done what we expected it to do. But I do think, the path ahead, probably a little bit rocky, but at least we're in a much better place than we were back then.
So, David, government.
Yes.
How was the year for government?
It's been a year in which Rishi has worked extraordinarily hard to try and portray himself as a competent person, someone who doesn't create drama and chaos. And to a certain extent, he has succeeded in that we're only now getting back into stories appearing in papers about leadership options. Yes. So that Gorgon's head is slowly starting to resurface. But by and large, by the standards of what had come before, he'd steadied it. The problem is the one thing where he did want to make a significant difference is in the opinion polls. And while there's been a slight narrowing, there hasn't been that coming together of the tracks that you need to see to have people credibly talking about another Conservative victory. So that's his big challenge now, is just to create in the minds of reasonable people an expectation that it might happen.
Iain, how would you sum up last year?
Disappointing. It shows what we're trying to expect when, as Francis says, we think it's a good thing that we've avoided a recession. And, you know, these anemic levels of economic growth of 0 point whatever, rather than into even full percentage points. It makes you think, is this what it's going to be like for the rest of the decade? And what impact is that going to have on prosperity, employment, investment, and in general, that sense of economic well-being? Is it going to be a tough decade of low economic growth? And the signs are not good for that. I don't want to be unhappy and be a Christmas Scrooge, but it feels like the 2020s, Santa's sack's going to be quite empty.
Yeah, tough decade. Well, look, before we move on to 2024 predictions, I think we do need to mention the autumn statement, don't we? This was 22nd of November, if you remember. Francis, can you just remind us what the main announcement were, what you think the Chancellor was looking to achieve there?
So the main announcements were obviously the cut in national insurance contributions, full expensing, which actually was something that I think companies were really asking for. So from that perspective, probably a win, I think, for the government. We also obviously had the rise in the national living wage. I mean, what I would say was, I think what they were trying to do was to sort of have a boost, create, perhaps try to create some momentum, but that was not inflationary in terms of growth. And they were very much looking at the supply side, I think, to do that, because obviously on the demand side, that might fuel then inflation, but it very much a focus on the supply side this time. So, all in all, I mean, it could have been a lot better, but it could have been a lot worse.
Yeah, David, I mean, it was only September, wasn't it, when the Chancellor was saying tax cuts were virtually impossible. And then this national insurance cut, what changed?
I think, certainly the immediate thing that changed out of it was that people suddenly started talking about a May election being a possibility. There was also just, I think, a huge desire to give something for his foot soldiers in the party to actually take to the doorsteps and sell. That had been the refrain around Westminster, was, what do we actually have to sell on the doorsteps? And this refrain of, we can't just sell confidence and calm and steady. And suddenly they had that. And it was perhaps a way of signalling confidence in the economy that, we have this room to do this. And the magic word headroom was just bandied around so much. This idea that suddenly there was more money than expected.
Yes, because the October deficit, it was not quite as catastrophic as the OBR expected, was it? I think that's all you could say about it.
Pretty much, yes. There is, of course, still the elephant in the room, which is what happens to spending plans. Obviously, that'll come round in spring next year. But it's certainly, it was just a little bit of extra headroom that he was able to use.
Iain, you talk to people in business all the time. What was the general feeling about it?
It was a good autumn statement. And if I were Jeremy Hunt, I'd be both pleased that I provided a political autumn statement, so tax cuts, but actually provided a good fiscal and economic statement, doing exactly the right thing that the country needs for long-term sustainable growth. So permanent capital allowance expensing is a great thing to boost business investment. And he's done things in terms of target, really focused investment on things that the UK does well. So green manufacturing is a particular one. AI, government is very proud that we're third in the world behind the US and China for tech investment. The £500 million there should help us boost our position as a leading tech nation. So all of these things, in terms of all the ingredients to put in place a really good, long-term, healthy growth trajectory, he's done. And yet the OBR said it's not going to shift the dial one jot. And he must be really frustrated at that. He's doing the things that are right, subject to maybe you do fewer tax cuts or more tax cuts, but he's put in place those main ingredients and it's not had an ha'porth of difference.
I mean, obviously, this is not a political podcast, but I think, we've got to talk about the general election because that's going to be the big event, isn't it, of the coming year. It is going to be uppermost in Jeremy Hunt's mind. More widely, I mean, what does this all mean for the government's agenda for the coming year?
Suddenly, we're seeing what the reality of a world in which we no longer have the fixed-term Parliaments bill is. Because this is David Cameron's great innovation that we'd actually know when the election is. Now we're heading into a year where there are very rational people all making incredibly persuasive arguments for totally different dates. Because you have the mayoral elections coming up for places like Andy Street in the Midlands and so on, and Teesside, which was such an iconic Red Wall victory. Now, does the Prime Minister want to actually go before this happens? Does he want to go at the same time as it happens? Does he want to go after it happens? Because if he loses a string of quite iconic seats, that would just kill the morale of the party. The thinking still is it's going to be the autumn. All these rumours about maybe having a one-day autumn conference where Rishi will just stand up and announce that we're going to the polls. But then other people are saying you have a majority which is probably going to be bigger than what comes next. why would you put that at peril? And there's even talk of going long into January, depending to some people. And the big argument is, will people be feeling better? And the hope is that by having the early national insurance cuts and also the fact that lots of people got their pay increases based on a higher rate of when inflation was at a terrifying Himalayan height, that'll be starting to kick in from April onwards. So that's another argument for going long, that people will be feeling we have a bit of money, maybe we can have a nicer holiday this year.
So would that play into the thought there might be another rabbit out of the hat in the spring budget?
Absolutely. And not just one. We're expecting an entire hutch of rabbits. And possibly, if it goes long, a second autumn statement as well, with even more other creatures they'll have to find probably then.
And what might they be? Inheritance tax? Is that actually going to happen?
That was so heavily trailed.
Yeah.
And it's a wonderful dividing line with Labour. And the fact is, a lot of people in the southern seats, they'll come up to us and they say, I actually have constituents who own what was once a council house, which is now worth more than £500,000. And they've managed to amass capital, which they're now really, really worried about. Now, this is a conversation which is limited to a small section of the country. You don't hear this across the UK. But at the same time, Britain remains a very aspirational country. And there is a passion also in Tory ranks. It's something that does get people excited. They genuinely believe this is a moral case, that you shouldn't be taxed twice on your income, and being taxed at death is a horrible thing to do. So I wouldn't be in the slightest bit surprised if that happens. Stamp duty's been talked about as well, because certainly, even though we're so far behind in terms of the number of houses that we need, it still remains a punitive expense. And anything that can give people this year a sense that their aspirations might be fulfilled, well, if they're feeling slightly better in terms of their income, even though it may all be due to inflation, it will make them feel possibly that they're doing well in life. And if they're doing well in life, they might keep their faith in the young man in number 10.
So your sense is later rather than sooner?
I think so. Simply because if the polls were, say, 50% closer than they are right now, they might want to go for a gamble and just put the foot to the floor. But at the moment, I think it's they're just betting on the feel-good factor, starting to tingle the nation's toes.
Iain, you're an old Westminster hand. What do you think?
I've always thought an October general election. Prime ministers, once they get into number 10, quite like being prime minister. And so they want to go long. The autumn statement made me think the odds on a May election have been shortened because, the national insurance announcement and then something in the spring budget about tax cuts. So I think there are two things that lend themselves towards a May general election. First is, as David mentioned, there are significant mayoral and local elections. You want that concentration of activists working together. And if they go badly, which the polls seem to suggest they will for the Conservative Party, you then have a summer of absolute fear and discontent amongst Tory MPs who think they're about to lose their jobs. So you avoid that summer of discontent and leadership challenge and all of that. The second thing is, a big part of the government's domestic policy agenda is stop the boats. Most small boats come over the channel in the summer. And so does the Prime Minister, does number 10, does the government want literally wave after wave of headlines saying more boats are coming, that stack against it? So, as I said, if I were a betting man, I'd probably say October, but I wouldn't rule out May at this point.
Francis, casting vote? What do you think?
Gosh, to have the casting vote. I mean, I would have always said October, but I also know that obviously that does run into presumably what's happening on the Atlantic side, the other side of the Atlantic as well, I should say. Whilst that's not obviously my area of expertise, one wonders how that might play out. But I also think that October just gives the government another budget at least to get through. But certainly very interesting listening actually to the arguments on both sides.
Yeah, I mean, as Francis says, there are elections on the other side of the Atlantic too. Not really our territory, but just briefly, your thoughts on if it is another term for Trump.
Well, yes, it's certainly looking like a rematch of Biden-Trump. And it's fascinating. If you look at American magazines at the moment, they certainly those on the left are going through various stages of sort of catastrophism, really. And even on the right, there's great questions of what is the future of right of centre America? Has Trumpism truly cemented itself as? And you look at the debates that are happening, which Trump isn't taking part in. None of it matches traditional right of centre conservative politics here. When you think of Reagan and Thatcher and how they were joined at the hip on a common mission to remake, not just winning the Cold War, but also remaking the economy, very, very different images. And an America that's isolationist and protectionist is going to scare a lot of people around the UK, and especially with Ukraine continuing to be seen as such tragedy. That's a deep worry in conservative circles at the moment, that you might have a Republican administration which is not at all enthusiastic about NATO, and some elements of it are positively hostile to Ukraine, it seems, as well.
Yeah, Francis, what do you think? How would that, tip the dial over here economically?
I mean, it's bound to have, a knock-on effect in terms of what happens. But it's whether that's immediate or whether that's more of a long-term issue. That's actually quite difficult to get your head round, because I could certainly see if we've got obviously Trump and the fact that he might pull out of all sorts of area. I mean, if they pull out of NATO, well, I mean, OK, there's the issue of what does that do to NATO, but then what does the budget and all the rest of it? Are we going to have to put more in? Is everyone else going to have to put more in? Obviously, there are fiscal implications for that. So, I mean, those sorts of immediate things, but more the kind of longer term, does that going to give us investment issues? We're still trading obviously a lot with the US, and there's been that move to obviously try and supplement, because of Brexit, supplement elsewhere trade. So will that have an effect? It's quite difficult to know, because obviously no policies are really out there at the moment to understand quite what the knock-on effect might be, but an effect almost certainly. I mean, it's a global economy, so.
Coming back to the UK, Iain, what would ICAEW's key asks be of the main political parties ahead of our own general election?
We're at ICAEW going to publish a manifesto where we're going to ask our main asks of all parties for the general election. One of the themes that we've used over the last year or so is renewal and resilience. Both renewal in terms of, we're at the start of a new chapter in global economic history. There's the rise of artificial intelligence that's going to transform lots of the economy, but also there's the transition to a non-fossil fuel economy and the great market opportunities that provides. We've got to be at the forefront as a nation, as an economy, as a workforce with those big sweeping forces. But also, I think what the pandemic and other crises have shown is we've got a problem with resilience, supply chain difficulties. When things happen, we may be not as resilient on things like where does our energy come from? How do we get our raw materials? And so what can we do to become more resilient? The key point, Philippa, is the real story of the last 15 years is poor productivity performance. What do we do to make sure that we can become more productive? And that means more investment in skills, in infrastructure, in capital, and at a time of real tight economic restraint and weak public finances, how are we going to do that?
It does seem to me, and I think to everyone else, the big problem for the two main parties is distinguishing themselves from each other, isn't it?
Well, the big unsaid, David might want to comment, is there's not that much between them and there's not that much room for manoeuvre. The public finances are difficult. The key forces about things like demographics, we're an ageing population with more reliance upon health and social care. That's extraordinarily expensive. Francis has just mentioned, the defence pressures that we've got with Ukraine, to some extent the Middle East. We've had a sort of peace dividend since the end of the Cold War, some 30 years ago. Now that's probably coming to an end. We need to spend more on defence. All of these different forces. And of course, how do we make sure that we're competitive? Well, we need to spend on infrastructure. And again, David's just mentioned the debate that we had this year on HS2. Big capital projects being stopped. So this is what the dialogue is. But in terms of the way that, there's a clear path for any government, regardless of political complexion, that's not necessarily the case.
But regardless of party politics, it all plays out, Francis, against this backdrop of weak and stagnant economic circumstances, doesn't it? I mean, the OBR forecast, the Bank of England forecast, they're not entirely identical. Obviously, but generally, well, actually, would you like to clarify that for us? Why aren't they the same? Why are they often so at odds?
slightly strange that they should be quite so divergent. It's more in the sort of latter years rather than obviously not for this year because we're pretty much through it. But yeah, the Bank of England have been much weaker, but they have been much weaker throughout the last couple of years. And slowly but surely they have been sort of rowing back from that. So it'll be interesting to see. I mean, obviously they update their forecast every quarter, so we'll need to wait till February for the next round. But yeah, that will be interesting, partly because they are pretty much the only forecaster who's really got a recession in there. There are one or two others with very small ones, but theirs is somewhat larger. Whereas I would say the OBR forecasts are more in line with external views in terms of, where we think we're going to head. But I mean, let's face it, neither of them make particularly great reading if you're actually wanting an economy that's going to grow.
There's many, many things still holding the UK back, aren't there? Consumer confidence being one, better than it was, but not great.
It's not quite as, I think it dropped to something like -50 at one point, which is the lowest it's ever been. So that's how bad it got. It's much improved on that. And interestingly, business confidence is slightly better than consumer confidence. So difficult to read into that. But it really all goes back to this point about productivity, which obviously Iain has already highlighted. And the fact is, our productivity growth is appalling. I mean, it's less than 1% for the last sort of decade. Obviously, prior to the 2008 recession, it was, up at around the sort of 2% mark. So it's fallen behind. It is much lower than, some of the G7 countries as well. And at the end of the day, investment, it's always been quite bad in the UK, even prior to, the decade and two that's just gone. But it has got significantly worse. But it's the skills. We just seem to lack the skills. And because we also have a demographic and a workforce issue, of course, now on top of that, it's really exacerbating it. But the one thing I will be interested in to see whether the parties distinguish themselves in the general election is what they're going to do about planning. Because if you talk to anybody, I think political or an economist, anyone like that, it's planning that is a real obstacle because, we haven't got enough people or we've got, as in to sort of put the plans through local authorities, or they're just, they're all over the place. So there needs to be more of that because actually, housing is an issue from an economic perspective. If you want people to go where the jobs are, you've got to have houses for them to live in. And that's part of our problem. We don't have that because we don't also have really good infrastructure for trains and transport, etc. That then, exacerbates a problem. So somewhere along the line, things need to. But I mean, when I talk about planning, it's also, of course, planning for things like transportation and stuff like that. So it's, planning in general. So that will be interesting. I'll be very interested to see if there's a dividing line on planning.
Iain, as Francis says, lots of structural issues holding us back. What does the ICAEW's Business Confidence Monitor tell us about the mood right now? How does it compare to where we were a year ago?
The Business Confidence Monitor has been going for the best part of 20 years and is a really good forecast mechanism by which you can see how economic growth will be in the next 12 to 18 months. Because obviously confidence now can move into hiring decisions, investment decisions, which will then have an impact upon economic growth. It's been pretty weak this year. The average over the BCM period since about 2004 is a positive of about 7, 8. It's been round about 2. So it's in positive territory. It didn't fall off a cliff, obviously, when COVID happened, a similar thing. But it's very weak, reflecting the fact that businesses, and probably I'd take slight issue here with Francis' comments, businesses are reflecting consumer lack of confidence here and just think we're not seeing large increases in growth potential. So although things are slightly better, they expect prices to continue to come down, so inflation is being tamed. I think there's a general sense that interest rates, which are at a 15-year high, will continue to stay high for longer, and that's going to have an impact upon consumer confidence.
And we've still got industrial action going on, haven't we? That hasn't gone away. We stopped talking about it, but it hasn't gone away.
The Bank of England, the chief economist, has done some business confidence monitor stuff with us, with ICAEW, and the bank makes the good point that we imported our inflation about 15 months ago from, supply chain issues from Ukraine and the energy funds. But the second wave of inflation is because of service constraints, is about wage inflation. That's very much domestic. But if you're seeing inflation of 6, 7, 8%, you want to see your pay go up by a similar amount. You don't want to see your standard of living go backwards. So that's entirely understandable as well. So how do we go back to the phrase that I was using, how do we have that resilient economy where we see productivity gains that again flow through to real sustainable increases in the standard of living?
So what do you think the Business Confidence Monitor will do this year?
In 2024, I think it will be somewhat flat again. I mean, we might start to see interest rates go down, but I think the governor and the chief economist of the bank have been very clear they're going to stay higher for longer. And it's a case of that's going to, we're a service economy and we are essentially, for a large part, a home-owning democracy. But even if you're renting, the impact about this flows through to what you pay in rent. So this is a key part. There's a wider point that Francis alluded to, which is for the last, since the 60s and 70s, we haven't built enough homes in this country. And we need to do something like that. Now, whether any future government, any future parliament can deal with the planning system and essentially say to the general population, you can't object to homes being built near you, and you can't object to the problems that might cause, because with infrastructure, with difficulties like that, that's a brave government that does that. Very brave government.
And yet we've got record rents now.
And it's a question of supply and demand. It's why house prices are high. This is a consequence of 40 to 50 years of not building enough houses.
Inflation, Francis, just before we get to the end of all this, that was the one we all talked about last year as the thing that was strangling every hope everyone had. Where do you see that in 12 months' time?
My feeling is it will slowly go back towards target. It may take to the end of 2024, it may go into 25. But I think once you get to that sort of below 3, even though it's not 2.0.
Not the target, but close enough.
I mean, 2.4, 2.0. I think for most people at that point, they'll feel relatively content. And then, of course, the question comes, and Iain alluded to, when's bank rate being cut? And it's been very interesting to watch what the markets think versus all the pushback from all the Monetary Policy Committee members. And they've pretty much all pushed back to say higher for longer. We're not cutting rates, anytime soon. So, and on that, I would say we aren't going to get any kind of direction on that until the point where they're pretty much ready to actually cut. So I don't think there's going to be a lead time into it or anything like that. So then, what's happening with wage growth is probably the key there, because as Iain alluded to, that's really what's causing this second round effect. We were unlucky perhaps to have all these different, what were termed transitory effects. Now, they are transitory technically, but when you have 3 or 4 of them in a row, they obviously become quite embedded, and that has caused the wage growth to be embedded. So we've now got that. But that's what they're going to be keen to see. That falling will then help to determine when the cuts might come.
We're going to wrap up this first podcast of 2024, just the same way we did a year ago, with predictions and hopes for the year ahead. What would you all like to happen in the next 12 months? What do you think will happen? David?
I think we'd all love to see less turmoil where there is genuine horror shows, which seem to be eluding any sort of immediate diplomatic solution, because obviously there's the situation in the Middle East, which is going to have very long-term repercussions, and Ukraine is so far from an endgame. And of course we see Putin will be up for election again. That is going to be a major change in the atmosphere, I think, where he'll be coming in with what he will say is a new mandate, but also be having an argument with his immediate power brokers around him about what happens in Ukraine. And I think that's somewhere where, especially if the West is potentially about to be adapting to a new president as well, this could be one of the times where the entire trajectory and future of Europe is going to be in flux. So I would love it if wise and brave heads somehow emerged, which can happen. As we've seen, but we just need some brilliant leaders. And I think one of the questions we've just been talking about, skills in business and things, the same question is being matched in politics, because it is a toxic job a lot of the time to be an MP. The money isn't great. The sacrifices that the wider families have to put up with are immense. And, where are the JFKs and, the sort of people who put the Good Friday Agreement behind the scenes in all parties, that type of people who are willing to take a risk. And I think would also, if suddenly interest rates did go down and stamp duty perhaps went down and home ownership became within reach of a greater population, I think we would see a generational wave of euphoria, which could be quite transformational in our politics.
That's quite a big shopping list. Iain, tell us your hopes and fears.
I'm going to have a big shopping list as well.
Okay.
And I suppose they're all linked. I think what businesses want is certainty. So that's a sort of global macro. Let's not see these shocks and upheavals that we've had, arguably for the last 15 years, but certainly for the last 5 or so. So a period where things are stable. But also, and this is much more in our gift or in the gift of the government, can we have policy certainty and stability? Stop changing things, because that's a real burden on business. We have to spend money in order to keep up to date with regulation, and particular regulators doing things that maybe are at odds with each other. So not having a consistency of regulatory approach is a real burden on business. So policy certainty's my first ask. The other two are sort of linked in some way. First is, I'd love us to break the shackles of poor productivity performance. It's the only way this country's going to prosper. And so having that, focused investment, trying to unlock some of that business investment, that's absolutely key. And the third thing is, I think we were pretty good, Philippa, last year in our forecasts. One of the things we didn't really forecast was the rise of AI and ChatGPT. And it'd be interesting, I think 2024, it's all hype at the moment. And it's all this, the economy is going to be completely transformed in either a good way or a bad way. The robots are coming to take our jobs. And 2024, I think you'll start to see some of that mist clear. And can AI be used as a way to really drive forward productivity gains without making sure that large swathes of the workforce lose their jobs? That'll be a key policy challenge. But that could make sure that we can all have rising standards of living.
I mean, you're right. I think The Economist agreed with you. I think it was their word of the year, wasn't it? ChatGPT. Francis, your thoughts?
I think a lot of it's actually been covered. I mean, I'm absolutely with everyone on this one. We need some stability and we need some focus on long-term goals. I've talked about planning. That is going to take time. It's going to be very hard for any one government. You need a much more consensus view on that. So I'd love to be able to see that. Some kind of consensus view on planning would be fantastic. I have to say I'm slightly sceptical, but you never know. You never know. We can all hope. And actually, I would say on the sort of investment side, I was really pleased to hear about the amount of money from Hampton Court when they talked about, I think it was a 29.5 million and lots of investment coming from Nissan as well, which is obviously up near Iain's neck of the wood.
Iain's neck of the woods, yeah.
So there are positives there. Investment is key. So, more of that would be fantastic. And then I really do think,
neck of the woods,
we need to think about how we better skill the workforce. There's AI coming, and that is both can be extremely useful. I think it could be used with an awful lot of jobs to help, make those make it more productive in terms of what they do, so they can do more. Particularly in the NHS, actually, I think it could work really well for them. But there's always going to be some of those jobs that will be at risk. And I think it's just thinking about, how do we deal with that? How do we set up some policies that will help to reskill those people? I think that's very important.
Francis, Iain, David, thanks so much. It's always so fascinating to get your analysis and predictions. Can we book you for a year's time? So we can check in on what was right, what was wrong, and of course what the UK looks like the other side of a general election. Well, we think it's going to be, probably, don't we, before January next year. Thanks very much. The Insights in Focus series returns later this month to discuss the progress, or perhaps lack of progress, on audit reform in the UK. And in February, the Insights series will be back to share the latest news and developments from right across accountancy and ICAEW. Thanks for being with us today. If you're finding these podcasts useful, please do subscribe to the series on your app. You'll never miss an episode.